house. Roll down the window immediately. I said roll it down now or I'm breaking it.
Rebecca?
No, this can't be...
The cold Tuesday night of October 15th, 2024, should have been a routine patrol for Officer Michael Hartley. A 13-year veteran who had worked night shift for so long, he knew every street and alley of his assigned zone, as well as the hallways of his own home. It was 10:47 p.m. when he noticed a dark sedan with a burned-out taillight making a turn onto a quiet residential street. A minor traffic violation that would normally result in a quick warning and perhaps a recommendation to fix the light. Michael activated his emergency lights and signaled for the driver to pull over, following procedure he had executed literally thousands of times over his career. But as he approached the stopped vehicle with his body camera, recording as always, and as his flashlight illuminated the car's interior, revealing the driver's face, Michael literally stopped in the middle of the street, his brain refusing to process what his eyes were seeing because the woman sitting behind the wheel was his wife, Sarah, who had died in a car accident exactly 2 years, 3 months, and 14 days earlier. Michael Hartley had met Sarah Chambers when they were both in college, he studying criminal justice and she pursuing nursing. They had fallen in love during a group project on emergency medical response, had married 6 months after graduation, and had built a life that seemed perfect in its simplicity. Sarah had worked as an emergency room nurse at the regional hospital, while Michael rose through the ranks of the police department. They hadn't had children, partly because they both worked irregular shifts that made it difficult to plan for a family, and partly because they had always thought they would have time later, that they could wait until careers were established and schedules became more predictable. That later had never come. On July 22, Sarah had been driving home after a night shift at the hospital when her vehicle had skidded on an oil patch on the highway, collided with a guardrail, and rolled 3 times before coming to rest upside down in a ditch beside the road. First responders had arrived within minutes, but Sarah had been declared dead at the scene, massive internal injuries and head trauma making survival impossible. Michael had been notified by the chief himself, who had come personally to his house rather than sending a chaplain, because Michael was a respected member of the department and deserved that personal courtesy. The 2 years since had been a fog of grief, mandatory therapy to ensure he was fit to continue in service, and attempts to find meaning in a life that suddenly seemed empty without Sarah in it. Michael had dealt with his grief the only way he knew how, by burying himself in work. He had voluntarily taken on extra shifts, had worked every holiday, had essentially lived at work because returning to the home he had shared with Sarah was too painful. His colleagues had tried to help, inviting him to family dinners, suggesting support groups for widowers, gently encouraging him to consider counseling. Michael had gone through the motions of mandatory therapy, had told the department therapists what they needed to hear to certify him as psychologically fit for service, but he had never really processed his grief in a healthy way. He had simply pushed it down and continued functioning. The night of October 15th had started like any other night shift. Michael had checked equipment, had reviewed briefing on recent crime activity in his zone, had begun patrol through familiar streets. He had made 3 traffic stops earlier that shift, all routine, all resulting in warnings or minor citations without incident. The stop of the dark sedan at 10:47 p.m. had seemed equally routine. Burned-out taillight, quiet residential street. No sign of impaired or suspicious driver behavior. Michael had approached the driver's side, with flashlight in hand and body camera recording, his mind already rehearsing the standard, words he would use to explain the stop. But then the flashlight illuminated the vehicle's interior, and Michael saw the driver's face, and every thought in his mind evaporated instantly. The woman looking at him through the driver's window had Sarah's face. Not resembled Sarah, not reminded him of Sarah, had Sarah's identical face. The same delicate features, the same brown eyes, the same dimple in her left cheek that appeared when she was nervous, the same small mole just above her right eyebrow that Sarah had always hated, but that Michael had loved. It was impossible. It was completely impossible. But there she was, looking at him with the expression of polite nervousness people always had when stopped by police. Michael's body camera captured everything as he stood frozen beside the vehicle, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand, as he tried to make sense of the impossible. The woman rolled down the driver's window, the movement so familiar it cut through Michael like a blade because Sarah had always lowered her window exactly that way, with a slight hesitation as she located the button in the dark. The woman's voice, when she spoke, completed the disturbing illusion. She asked if there was a problem, officer, the tone polite but slightly nervous. And it was Sarah's voice, exactly the timbre and cadence Michael had heard 1,000 times saying his name, laughing at his jokes, whispering that she loved him. Michael realized he had been standing in silence for an abnormally long time, that the woman was beginning to look genuinely concerned. He forced himself to speak, his voice coming out hoarse and unsteady in ways that never happened during routine stops. He said something about the burned-out taillight, the words coming out mechanically while his mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Sarah was dead. He had identified her body at the morgue, had held her cold hand during those terrible final moments before they took her away. He had arranged her funeral, had watched her casket lowered into the ground, had visited her grave every week for 2 years. The woman responded she hadn't realized about the taillight, that she would get it fixed tomorrow morning, her voice so calmly reasonable and familiar that Michael felt dizziness sweeping over him. He asked for her driver's license and registration, the words coming out automatically from years of muscle training, even as his brain screamed, this was impossible. The woman reached into her glove compartment, moving with the same graceful economy of motion Sarah had always had, and retrieved the documents. As she extended them to Michael through the window, their hands nearly touched, and Michael had to force himself not to pull back because for one irrational, terrifying moment, he half expected his hand to pass right through hers as if she were a ghost. Michael took the documents, his own hand visibly shaking now. He pointed his flashlight at the driver's license and read the name printed there. Emma Richardson, age 34, address in a city approximately 50 miles away. The photo on the license showed the same face looking at him from the driver's seat, the same face that belonged to his dead wife. Michael looked from the license to the woman and back to the license, his police training warring with his growing sense of unreality. IDs could be faked. People could steal identities. But why would someone create a fake ID with a photo of his dead wife? Emma Richardson was looking at him now, with expression shifting from polite nervousness to genuine concern. She asked if he was okay, if he needed her to call someone. The question was so characteristically Sarah, always worried about others even when she, herself, was in an uncomfortable situation, that Michael felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crumble. He said he was fine, just had had a long shift, but his voice carried a tension anyone could hear. Emma tilted her head slightly, studying him with an expression Michael recognized from countless moments with Sarah, that analytical nurse look of assessing a patient for signs of distress. Michael realized he needed to either end this traffic stop or explain why he was behaving so strangely. He opted to end it, returning the license and registration, and telling Emma he was giving her a verbal warning about the taillight, that she should get it fixed as soon as possible. Emma thanked him, but didn't immediately begin rolling up her window or preparing to drive away. Instead, she continued looking at Michael with that concerned expression, and then she asked a question that nearly stopped Michael's heart. She asked if they had met before, because he seemed so familiar to her. The question hung in the air between them. Michael could feel his body camera recording every second of this surreal interaction, preserving evidence of either him having a psychological breakdown or something genuinely impossible happening. He said no, he didn't think they had met before, but even as the words came out, he was studying her face, intently searching for any small difference from Sarah. Was there a small scar near her hairline that Sarah hadn't had? Or had it always been there and he had never noticed? Were her eyes exactly the same shade of brown, or was there a slight difference he was failing to see in the dim light? Emma continued looking at him for another moment, then gently shook her head as if dismissing the thought. She said she must be mistaken, that she probably just had one of those faces. She began rolling up her window, preparing to leave. Michael knew he should let her go, that he had completed the traffic stop and there was no legal reason to detain her further. But as she began moving to put the car in gear, words came out of Michael's mouth before he could stop them. He asked where she was coming from, where she was going, questions that had no relevance to a burned-out taillight traffic stop. Emma stopped, her hand still on the gear shift, and looked at him with an expression that was now clearly wary. She responded she had been visiting a friend in the area, that she was driving back home now. Her voice carried an edge of defensiveness that came from being questioned by a police officer without clear reason. Michael realized he was crossing professional lines, that his behavior was becoming inappropriate and potentially frightening, but he couldn't let it go. He asked what she did for a living. Emma hesitated, then said she was a nurse, worked in a hospital emergency room in her hometown. The confirmation she was a nurse, Sarah's same profession, sent another wave of unreality over Michael. He asked how long she had been a nurse. Emma responded approximately 10 years, her voice now definitely cautious. She asked why he was asking these questions, if there was some problem beyond the taillight. Michael had no good answer. He said he was just doing routine verification, but they both knew there was nothing routine about his line of questioning. Emma said politely but firmly that if he didn't have any more official questions, she would like to continue her trip home. Michael knew he had to let her go. He had no legal basis to detain her beyond the warning he had already issued. But as Emma began again moving to put the car in gear, Michael noticed something that made his blood freeze. On the passenger seat was a nurse's bag, exactly the type Sarah had always carried, and hanging from the rearview mirror was a small charm, a small silver heart that looked identical to the one Michael had given Sarah on their first anniversary, the one she had kept in her car as a reminder of them until the day she died. Michael pointed his flashlight at the charm hanging from the rearview mirror, his heart pounding so loud he could hear it in his ears. The small silver heart spun gently in the car's air conditioning, catching the light in ways that were so familiar it caused physical pain. But what made Michael finally break his professional training and cross a definitive line was that he could see a tiny inscription on the back of the heart, words he himself had engraved. M&S forever. Michael and Sarah. Forever. The same words that were engraved on the heart he had given Sarah, the heart he had assumed was buried with her. He asked, his voice breaking in ways he couldn't control, where Emma had gotten that charm. Emma followed his gaze to the silver heart, her expression changing from wary to genuinely confused. She said it was hers, that she had always had it. Michael shook his head, saying he needed to see it more closely, that this was important. Emma now looked alarmed, her hand moving, instinctively to lock the car doors. She said he was scaring her, that she had cooperated with the traffic stop, but that he had no right to demand to see her personal belongings without a warrant or probable cause. Emma's response was legally correct and perfectly reasonable, but it made something break inside Michael. He said, his voice now desperate in ways he knew would be captured by his body camera and probably end his career, that he had given an identical charm to his wife, that his wife had died 2 years ago, that Emma looked exactly like her. The words came out in a torrent he couldn't stop, breaking every rule of professional conduct, but he couldn't hold it inside anymore. Emma looked at him with shock, her eyes widening as she processed what he had just said. For a long moment she simply sat there, her hand still on the door lock, staring at this police officer who had stopped her for a burned-out taillight and was now telling her she looked like his dead wife. Then, gently, she said she was sorry for his loss, but that she wasn't his wife, that she was Emma Richardson, and she had lived her entire life in a city 50 miles away. She suggested maybe he should call his supervisor, that maybe he shouldn't be on duty if he was seeing his dead wife and random strangers. The suggestion was made gently, even kindly, but it cut Michael deeply because she was right. He was violating every protocol, was behaving in ways that were textbook signs an officer wasn't fit for duty. But before he could respond, Emma did something unexpected. She reached up to the rearview mirror, unclipped the heart charm, and held it toward the light so she could see the back. When she saw the inscription, M&S forever, her expression changed from cautious sympathy to something much more complicated. Confusion, recognition, and something that looked almost like fear flashed across her face. Emma lowered the charm slowly, her hand shaking now too. She said, her voice barely above, a whisper that she didn't understand. She said the charm had been given to her by her mother years ago, that her mother had said it had belonged to a dear friend who had passed. Emma asked Michael's wife's name. When Michael whispered Sarah Hartley, maiden name Chambers, Emma went pale even in the dim light. She said her mother's name was Patricia Chambers, that Patricia had had an older sister named Sarah, who she rarely spoke about, a sister who had died when Emma was too young to remember her. The revelation hung between them, as both struggled to process the implications. If Patricia Chambers was Emma's mother, and Patricia had had a sister named Sarah, That meant Emma was Sarah's niece. But that didn't explain why Emma looked identical to Sarah rather than merely familiar. Michael asked, his voice tight with emotion, if Emma's mother had ever mentioned that Sarah had had a twin sister. Emma shook her head slowly, then stopped, a flash of memory crossing her face. She said her mother had always been strange about her family, that there were photos Patricia kept in a box in the closet she never showed anyone, that there were questions about the past Patricia simply refused to answer. Michael felt his entire world shifting beneath his feet. Sarah had never mentioned having a twin sister. She had talked about her younger sister Patricia, but always in past tense, always with pain in her voice that suggested a complicated relationship. Sarah had told Michael she and Patricia had drifted apart years before he and Sarah met, that Patricia had made choices Sarah couldn't support, and that contact between them had become sporadic, and then ceased completely. Michael had assumed it was typical sister stuff, something about money or men or lifestyle disagreements. He had never pressed for details because when Sarah talked about Patricia, there was pain in her eyes that made Michael want to protect her from whatever hurt her. Emma was looking at the charm in her hand, with the expression of someone seeing a familiar object under completely new light. She said her mother had always been secretive about her family, that Emma had grown up knowing almost nothing about her grandparents or other relatives. Patricia had said her family didn't approve of her choices, that they had cut off contact, and that it was better not to ask questions about them. Emma had accepted this as children accept parents' explanations, but as she grew older, she had begun to question why her mother was so determined to keep her away from any connection with extended family. Michael asked if Emma's mother was still alive. Emma said Patricia had died 3 years ago, cancer that had taken her quickly. Emma noted, her voice breaking slightly, that her mother had been gone only a year after her Aunt Sarah would have died. Though Patricia had never mentioned Sarah's death to Emma, the timeline made something click in Michael's mind. Sarah had died in July 2022. If Patricia had died 3 years ago, in 2021, that meant Patricia had died before Sarah, not after. But Emma had just said Patricia died 3 years ago, which would be 2021, and that Sarah had died a year before that. Michael gently corrected Emma, saying Sarah had died in July 2022, not 2021. Emma looked confused, then checked the date on her car's dashboard as if confirming the current year was really 2024. She said she must have gotten confused about the timeline, that the last few years had been a blur since losing her mother. But something about the confusion bothered Michael. Emma seemed genuinely uncertain about when her mother had died versus when her aunt had supposedly died, as if there were two conflicting timelines in her mind. Michael made a decision he knew was probably the end of his career, but that he couldn't help making. He told Emma they needed to talk more about this, that there were things about Sarah's family that didn't make sense, that the resemblance between Emma and Sarah couldn't just be coincidence. Emma hesitated, clearly torn between reasonable fear of continuing to talk with an emotionally unstable police officer at the side of the road at 11 p.m., and her own growing curiosity about the impossible connection between her and Michael's deceased wife. Finally, she agreed to meet Michael at a nearby public cafe that was open 24 hours, somewhere she would feel safe and where they could talk without the power dynamics of a traffic stop. Michael followed Emma to the cafe, his mind racing during the entire short drive. He radioed his supervisor and reported he was taking a 30-minute coffee break, omitting that he would be meeting with the driver he had just stopped, the driver who looked identical to his dead wife. As they entered the brightly lit cafe, Michael could see Emma clearly under the fluorescent lights for the first time. The resemblance to Sarah wasn't just striking, it was impossible. This wasn't a case of a relative who resembled Sarah. Emma was, in every visible respect, identical to Sarah. Same height, same build, same dark hair, falling in exactly the same way. Same delicate hands with the same nail shape. They sat at a corner table, coffee between them, both visibly shaken. Michael's body camera was still recording, capturing everything. Emma was the one who finally broke the silence. She said she had always known there were secrets in her family history, that her mother, Patricia, had been extraordinarily closed about the past. Emma had been raised believing she had no extended family, that it was just her and her mother against the world. Patricia had told Emma that Emma's father had left before she was born, that his family wanted nothing to do with them, and that Patricia's family had disowned her for getting pregnant out of wedlock. But now, confronted with this police officer who insisted she looked identical to his deceased wife, that wife had supposedly been Patricia's older sister, Emma began questioning everything she thought she knew. She asked Michael if he had photos of Sarah. With trembling hands, Michael pulled out his phone and navigated to the photo gallery he kept of Sarah, photos he looked at every night before sleeping. He turned the phone to show Emma and watched as color drained from her face. The woman in the photos wasn't just similar to Emma, it was Emma. Same features, same expression, same way of smiling. Emma looked from the photos to Michael, her breathing becoming shallow. She said she didn't understand how this was possible. People didn't just look identical unless they were identical twins, and Emma knew she didn't have a twin sister because she had been born as the only child of a single mother. Michael noted gently that if Patricia and Sarah were sisters, and if Sarah and Emma looked identical, there were only a few possible explanations. One was that Sarah and Patricia were identical twins, not just sisters, and Emma had inherited her mother's exact appearance. Another, more disturbing, was that there was something about the family history neither of them understood. Michael suggested they needed to find out the truth, that there were resources that could help them understand the impossible connection between Emma and Sarah. He mentioned DNA testing, birth records, perhaps medical records if they could get access. Emma agreed hesitantly, still visibly shaken, but now invested in understanding the mystery as much as Michael. They exchanged contact information, with Emma making Michael promise he would consult the department therapist about what had happened tonight. Michael agreed, knowing he would have to report the encounter anyway once it was recorded on his body camera. When Michael returned to the station after his shift ended at 6 a.m., he immediately went to his supervisor's office, Captain Jennifer Morrison, and requested an urgent meeting. Morrison, who had worked with Michael for years and had helped him through the worst of his grief after Sarah's death, agreed to see him immediately. Michael played the body camera footage from the traffic stop on Morrison's computer screen and watched as she viewed it, her expression changing from professional curiosity to growing concern as the video progressed. Morrison paused the video on a frame showing Emma through the car window, her resemblance to Sarah undeniable even through the body camera lens. She looked at Michael with a mixture of sympathy and professional concern. Morrison said she understood why Michael had been shaken, that the resemblance was indeed extraordinary, but that he had crossed multiple lines by continuing to question Emma after completing the traffic stop and then agreeing to meet her off-duty. Michael acknowledged he had violated protocol, but insisted there was more to the story than just a striking resemblance, that the charm with identical inscription, the fact Emma was apparently Sarah's niece, all of this pointed to something genuinely abnormal that required investigation. Morrison listened as Michael explained everything he and Emma had discussed at the cafe about Patricia Chambers being Emma's mother and Sarah's younger sister, about how Patricia had been secretive about family history, about the confusing timeline of deaths. Morrison took careful notes, her training as an investigator emerging even as she dealt with an emotionally compromised officer. She said she understood why Michael felt he needed to investigate this, but that he needed to do it through appropriate channels and not as an on-duty police officer. She ordered Michael to take mandatory leave for a week and consult with the department psychologist before returning to service. Michael protested he wasn't having a breakdown, that there was a genuine question here that needed investigating. Morrison cut him off gently, noting that regardless of whether or not there was a real mystery about Sarah's family, Michael's behavior during the traffic stop demonstrated he was too emotionally compromised to remain on duty. She emphasized this wasn't punishment, but a safety measure both for Michael and for the public. Michael reluctantly agreed, acknowledging Morrison was right that he wasn't in an appropriate mental state for policing. During his mandatory week of leave, Michael became obsessed with discovering the truth about Emma's connection to Sarah. He started at the beginning, obtaining Sarah's birth certificate from county records. The certificate listed Sarah Marie Chambers, born March 12, 1990, daughter of Robert and Helen Chambers. There was no mention of multiple birth or a twin sister. Michael then obtained Patricia's birth certificate, which listed Patricia Ann Chambers, born July 18, 1994, same parents. Patricia was 4 years younger than Sarah, not a twin. Michael then searched for Emma Richardson's birth certificate. What he found made his blood freeze. Emma Marie Richardson, born March 12, 2012, daughter of Patricia Ann Chambers, father listed as unknown. Emma's birth date was exactly 12 years after Sarah's birth date, same day and month. This could be coincidence, but Michael had learned during years of police work not to believe in coincidences when they stacked up this high. More disturbingly, when Michael calculated Emma's age based on the birth certificate, she should be 12 years old, not 34, as had appeared on her driver's license, and as she clearly appeared to be. Was there an error in the records, or was Emma's driver's license forged? Michael obtained a copy of Emma's driver's license application through a contact at the DMV, violating multiple protocols but unable to stop himself. The application listed Emma's birth date as March 12, 1990, Sarah's exact birth date, and showed Emma had obtained her license at 16 in 2006, the same age Sarah had gotten her license. Michael looked at the two conflicting documents, his mind struggling to make sense of how Emma could have two different birth dates in official records. The birth certificate said 2012, making her 12 years old. Driver's record said 1990, making her 34. One had to be wrong, but which? And why would there be conflicting records for the same person? Michael decided to approach this from a different angle. He contacted the hospital where Sarah had worked as a nurse and where she had died being brought in after the accident. He asked to speak with someone in medical records, claiming he needed information to close pending estate issues for Sarah. The records clerk was sympathetic, but said she couldn't release medical records without appropriate authorization. Michael asked if she could at least confirm Sarah's dates of employment. After checking, the clerk confirmed Sarah Chambers. Hartley had worked in the emergency department from February 2013 until her death in July 2022. Michael then asked, almost casually, if the record showed whether Sarah had ever listed family members or emergency contacts. The clerk hesitated, then said she shouldn't be sharing this, but that she remembered Sarah and wanted to help the widower. She said Sarah's employment records listed only Michael as emergency contact, with no other family members mentioned. But there was a note in the file that when Sarah had initially applied for the position in 2013, she had listed a younger sister named Patricia Chambers as a secondary emergency contact. That contact had been removed in 2015, with Sarah requesting it be deleted entirely. The timeline was beginning to form in Michael's mind. Sarah had started work at the hospital in 2013. She had initially listed Patricia as an emergency contact, but in 2015, Sarah had removed Patricia from her records. What had happened in 2015 that made Sarah cut her sister off so completely? And how did this relate to Emma, who according to the birth certificate was born in 2012, but according to driver's records was born in 1990? Michael contacted Emma and shared what he had discovered about the conflicting birth records. Emma was as confused as he was. She said she had always believed she was born in 1990, that all her school records, medical records, everything listed that birth date. She had never seen a birth certificate listing 2012. Michael suggested they get DNA testing, both to confirm Emma's relationship to Sarah and potentially to clarify the age question. Emma agreed, and they made arrangements to use a commercial DNA testing service. While waiting for DNA results, which would take several weeks, Michael continued investigating. He visited the cemetery where Sarah was buried, something he had done weekly for 2 years, but now with a different purpose. He located Patricia Chambers' grave, which according to Emma had died 3 years ago. The grave was in a different section of the cemetery, but it was there. Patricia Ann Chambers, 1994-2021. If Patricia had died in 2021 and Sarah in 2022, that meant Patricia had died first, contradicting what Emma had said about her mother surviving her aunt. Michael photographed both headstones, and then had another idea. He went to the cemetery's administrative office and asked to see burial records. The clerk was initially reluctant, but agreed to check basic information. Records confirmed Sarah Hartley had been buried in July 2022, with Michael listed as surviving spouse. But when Michael asked about Patricia Chambers' burial, the clerk frowned and said there was an unusual note in the file. Patricia Chambers had been registered for burial in March 2021, but her grave had been marked as empty, remains transferred in August 2022, just a month after Sarah had been buried. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. Why would Patricia's remains have been transferred from the cemetery a month after Sarah died? Transferred where and by whom? He asked the clerk if the record showed who had authorized the transfer. The clerk checked and said the transfer had been authorized by someone listed as next of kin, but that the name was illegible on the scanned form. There was a contact phone number, but when Michael tried it, it was disconnected. Michael was more determined than ever to uncover the truth. He returned to the hospital where Sarah had worked, this time asking to speak with someone who had worked with Sarah personally. The emergency department's head nurse, a 50-year-old woman named Linda Chen, had been Sarah's supervisor and agreed to meet Michael during her break. Linda remembered Sarah fondly, describing her as an exceptionally talented and compassionate nurse who had always gone above and beyond for her patients. Michael asked if Linda remembered Sarah ever mentioning family, particularly a younger sister. Linda paused, her face showing memory being retrieved. She said Sarah rarely talked about family, but that there was one incident Linda remembered vividly. Sometime in 2015, a young woman had appeared at the hospital asking for Sarah. The woman had claimed to be Sarah's sister and had demanded to see her immediately. Sarah had been visibly distressed when informed about the visitor and had refused to meet her. The woman had caused a small scene, insisting she needed to talk to Sarah about an urgent family matter. Security had eventually escorted the visitor out, but not before Sarah had seen her through a glass window. Linda remembered Sarah had gone pale, almost as if she had seen a ghost. Michael asked if Linda remembered what the visitor looked like. Linda thought for a moment, then said she remembered the woman had looked young, maybe early 20s, with dark hair and delicate features. Linda noted she had thought at the time the visitor had a slight resemblance to Sarah, as would be expected of sisters. Michael felt his pulse quicken. If Patricia had visited Sarah at the hospital in 2015, and if Emma had been born in 2012, according to the birth certificate, Patricia would have been 3 years old. The visitor clearly wasn't a small child. The visitor had to have been an adult, someone in her 20s. Linda continued, saying that after the incident, Sarah had asked Linda to ensure Patricia Chambers was never allowed to visit again. That security should have permanent instructions to deny her access. Sarah had also changed her emergency contact records at that time, removing any mention of Patricia. Linda had been concerned about how distressed Sarah had seemed, and had gently asked if everything was okay. Sarah had said only that she had reasons for not wanting contact with her sister, that Patricia had made choices Sarah couldn't accept, and that it would be better for everyone if they remained apart. Michael thanked Linda and left the hospital, his mind racing. He called Emma and shared what he had learned. Emma was silent for a long moment, then said something that made Michael's blood freeze. She said she had a vague memory, almost like a dream, of being at a hospital when she was younger. She remembered her mother, Patricia, talking with a woman who looked like Emma, remembered tension and emotion in the conversation, remembered being hurried away quickly. Emma had always assumed it was just a childhood dream or confused memory, but now she wondered if it had been real. Michael asked how old Emma thought she was when this happened. Emma said she wasn't sure, maybe 22 or 23. But then she stopped, confusion evident in her voice. She said if she was 22 in 2015, that would make sense with her being born in 1990, as her record said. But if she was born in 2012, she would have been only 3 in 2015, a small child, not a young woman capable of forming memories. Emma said her head was hurting, trying to reconcile the two timelines that existed in her mind, as if she had lived 2 different lives, or had 2 sets of memories that couldn't both be true. Michael suggested they needed to talk to someone who knew both Sarah and Patricia, someone who could provide perspective on the family history. He remembered the birth certificates had listed parents Robert and Helen Chambers. He located Robert Chambers, Sarah, and Patricia's father, who still lived in a small city approximately 100 miles away. Michael contacted Robert, explaining he was Sarah's widower, and that he had discovered some confusing questions about family history he hoped Robert could help clarify. Robert agreed to meet Michael, and Michael drove there the next day, bringing Emma with him. When Robert opened the door and saw Emma standing next to Michael, the elderly man went completely pale. He grabbed the doorframe for support, staring at Emma as if seeing a ghost. Robert whispered Sarah's name, then shook his head violently, saying this was impossible, that Sarah was dead. Michael gently explained this was Emma Richardson, that she believed she was Patricia's daughter. Robert looked from Emma to Michael, his expression changing from shock to something that looked almost like fear. Robert invited them inside, his hands shaking as he guided them to the living room. He sat down heavily, still staring at Emma. Michael. Asked directly if Sarah and Patricia had been identical twins. Robert shook his head, saying no. Sarah had been born in 1990 and Patricia in 1994. They were sisters, not twins. But then he stopped, looking at Emma with a disturbed expression. He said there was something he had never told anyone, something his late wife Helen had made him promise to keep secret. But seeing Emma now, identical to Sarah in every respect, Robert felt he could no longer keep the secret. Robert revealed that in 2012, Patricia had arrived at her parents' house in a state of panic, claiming she had done something terrible, that she needed help. Patricia had explained she had been involved in an abusive relationship and had just discovered she was pregnant. She didn't want the child's father to know about the pregnancy, was afraid of him. Helen had helped Patricia hide the pregnancy, had arranged for Patricia to stay with relatives in a different state until the baby was born. Emma had been born in March 2012, and Helen had helped Patricia create a birth certificate. But there was more. Robert hesitated, clearly struggling with whether to continue. Finally, he said, Patricia had become increasingly unstable after Emma's birth. She had developed what doctors called severe postpartum psychosis. Patricia had become fixated on her older sister Sarah, had begun believing she was Sarah, that she had lived Sarah's life. Helen had tried to get help for Patricia, but Patricia had refused treatment. The situation had escalated until Sarah had been forced to cut off all contact, fearing Patricia's obsession was dangerous. Robert explained Helen had done everything she could to help Patricia care for Emma while protecting Sarah from Patricia's fixation. But then Helen had died in 2016, and Robert had lost contact with Patricia completely. He had assumed Patricia had finally gotten the help she needed, had raised Emma, had moved on with life. He had never imagined Emma would grow up looking exactly like Sarah, or that Patricia's obsession could have affected Emma in ways that were still unfolding. Michael and Emma sat in stunned silence as they processed Robert's revelation. But something still didn't make sense. Emma clearly wasn't a 12-year-old child. She was an adult in her 30s, with memories of an entire lifetime, a career as a nurse, driver's records dating back to 2006. How could she have been born in 2012 but have lived a life that required 34 years? Robert looked at Emma, confusion on his own face. He said he didn't understand how Emma could look adult when she should be only 12. Unless, he hesitated, unless Patricia had done something else, something no one had discovered. Emma suddenly stood up, her face pale. She said she remembered something, a flash of memory that didn't make sense. She remembered being at a medical clinic, her mother, Patricia, talking with doctors about a special procedure, something about growth acceleration or aging therapy. Emma had always dismissed this as a strange dream, but now she wondered if it had been real. Robert looked horrified, saying he had never heard about Patricia doing anything like that such technology shouldn't even exist. Michael suggested they needed to find out where Patricia had taken Emma after Helen's death in 2016, what medical clinics she had visited, what treatments Emma might have received. But before they could investigate further, Michael's phone rang. It was the DNA lab with results from the test he and Emma had done weeks ago. Michael put it on speaker so Emma and Robert could hear. The lab technician explained the results. Emma Richardson and Sarah Hartley shared 100% identical DNA. They weren't just sisters or cousins, they were genetically the same person. The silence following the DNA lab's revelation was absolute. Michael, Emma, and Robert stood staring at each other, each struggling to process the impossible. Emma and Sarah shared 100% identical DNA. The lab technician, unaware of the drama her call had triggered, continued explaining that such perfect match would normally only be seen in identical twins, but that the level of concordance was so complete it suggested something beyond normal twinning. The technician mentioned she had verified the results multiple times because they were so unusual, and suggested there might be error in sampling or cross-contamination. Michael ended the call, his hands shaking. He looked at Emma, who had sat down again and was holding her head as if in pain. Emma said she felt like her entire reality was disintegrating, that every certainty she had had about who she was and where she came from was revealing itself to be a lie or impossibility. She asked in a small, broken voice if she was even a real person, or if she was some kind of clone or copy Patricia had created in her obsession with Sarah. Robert looked as shaken as Emma and Michael. He said that when Helen was alive, She had occasionally mentioned Patricia was involved with scientists and researchers who claimed to be working on experimental therapies. Helen had worried Patricia was being taken advantage of by charlatans, but Patricia had insisted the people she was working with were legitimate, that they could help her in ways conventional medicine couldn't. Robert had never thought much about this at the time, assuming they were just the kinds of alternative therapies many people explored. But now, he wondered if Patricia had taken Emma to these researchers, if something had been done to Emma that explained the impossibilities they were discovering. Michael made the decision to report everything they had discovered to appropriate authorities. The situation had gone far beyond a personal matter of grief or family. Discovery. If Emma had been subjected to unauthorized medical experimentation as a child, if someone had developed technology that could accelerate human aging or clone people, this was a public health and potentially criminal matter requiring official investigation. He contacted the FBI, explaining he was a police officer who had stumbled upon evidence of possible unethical human experimentation involving a minor. The agent who took the call was initially skeptical, but when Michael explained about the 100% DNA match between two people with birth dates separated by 22 years, the agent's tone changed to serious interest. A federal investigation team was assigned to the case within a week. Investigators interviewed Michael, Emma, and Robert extensively. They obtained all the records Michael had collected, plus additional medical records, Patricia's financial records, any documentation that could shed light on what had happened. What they discovered painted a disturbing picture of a woman who had become so consumed by obsession with her sister that she had crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. Patricia's financial records revealed that between 2012 and 2016, she had made substantial regular payments to a facility listed only as Genesis Bio Research Clinic in a distant state. Investigators located the facility, which had been shut down in 2017 after what was officially described as building code violations, but which federal investigation now revealed had been a much more controversial closure involving allegations of unauthorized medical research. The clinic had been run by Dr. Marcus Velasquez, a brilliant but controversial geneticist who had lost medical credentials in 2010 for conducting unapproved experiments in gene therapy. Federal investigators located Dr. Velasquez, who now lived under an assumed name in a foreign country. Under threat of extradition and criminal charges, Velasquez agreed to cooperate with the investigation. What he revealed was simultaneously scientifically fascinating and ethically horrifying. Velasquez admitted he had developed an experimental process that combined cloning, gene therapy, and modified growth hormones to create what he called accelerated development clones. The process involved taking a DNA sample from an adult person, creating a cloned embryo, but then subjecting it to hormone cocktails and genetic modifications that sped up physical development while attempting to preserve memory formation and cognitive function. Patricia had approached Velasquez in 2011, obsessed with the idea of having a version of her sister, Sarah she could control, who would love her back in the way Sarah never had. Velasquez, needing funds and human test subjects for his illegal research, had agreed to help her. He had obtained a DNA sample from Sarah through Patricia, had created a cloned embryo, and had implanted it in a surrogate Patricia had paid for. Emma had been born in March 2012, genetically identical to Sarah, but technically only hours old. But then Velasquez had begun experimental treatments, injecting Emma with hormone cocktails designed to accelerate her physical development. The treatments had worked beyond Velasquez's expectations. Emma had developed physically at a rate of approximately 3 years for every chronological year. At 4 years chronological age, she appeared to be 12. At 8, she appeared to be 24. But the process had had side effects Velasquez hadn't fully anticipated. Emma's memories were confused, mixing things she had actually experienced with what appeared to be inherited memories from Sarah's DNA template. Emma sometimes remembered events from Sarah's childhood, as if they were her own. She had remembered learning to drive in a car Sarah had driven, on streets where Sarah had learned, even though this had occurred years before Emma was born. Patricia, in her untreated psychosis, had encouraged this confusion. She had told Emma she was Sarah, that her other life had just been a dream. Patricia had created false records, including a driver's license listing Emma's birth date as 1990, Sarah's same date. She had told Emma stories from Sarah's childhood, as if they were Emma's memories. When Helen tried to intervene after discovering what Patricia was doing, Patricia had cut off contact with her mother, taking Emma and disappearing for a period of time. After Helen's death in 2016, Patricia had emerged again, now with Emma appearing to be an adult in her 20s, perfectly positioned to assume an identity that was simultaneously her own and Sarah's. But then Patricia had died in 2021, leaving Emma alone with a confused set of memories and identities. Emma had continued living as an adult because it was all she knew, working as a nurse because it was what she remembered doing, driving a car, and living an independent life, despite chronologically being only 9 years old when her mother died. Her accelerated development had slowed after the treatment stopped in adolescence, stabilizing at the appearance of someone in her 30s. She looked 34 because that was the age Sarah would be now, the age Emma's body had been forced to reach through artificial intervention. The federal investigation resulted in multiple findings and recommendations, but legal and ethical challenges were profound. Emma was legally a 12-year-old child who appeared to be and functioned as a 34-year-old adult. Did she have legal rights? Could she consent to medical decisions? Was she a victim of illegal human experimentation, or was she herself the illegal result of that experimentation? Lawyers and bioethicists debated these questions for months while Emma existed in legal limbo. Michael became Emma's advocate during this period, using his position as Sarah's widower to argue that regardless of how Emma had been created, she was a person with rights who deserved protection and support. He worked with attorneys to establish Emma's legal status, eventually securing court recognition that regardless of chronological age, Emma functioned as an adult and should be treated as such under law. The decision established a complex but necessary precedent for dealing with realities of advanced biotechnology that law had not yet contemplated. Emma struggled profoundly with the revelations about her origins. She entered extensive therapy, working with psychologists specializing in trauma and dissociation, to try to separate her own actual memories from inherited memories from Sarah, to build a sense of identity that was authentically hers rather than a copy of someone else. The process was painful and often felt impossible. How did she define who she was when her cells, her memories, even her face belonged to someone who had died before Emma was created? Michael and Emma developed a strange but deep relationship. He wasn't her husband, though she carried his wife's DNA. She wasn't Sarah, though every time he looked at her, he saw his wife's face. They became something like family, united by the shared tragedy of both being victims of Patricia's obsession. Michael helped Emma navigate the legal and medical complexities of her situation. Emma helped Michael finally process his grief about Sarah, forcing him to confront the reality that Sarah was truly dead, and that Emma, despite sharing Sarah's DNA, was a different person with her own right to life and identity. The story eventually leaked to media, creating a global sensation. Headlines screamed about cloned woman, aged clone, and woman with 2 lives. Ethicists debated the moral implications of cloning humans without consent, of accelerating human development, of creating a person as a copy of someone else. Scientists questioned Velázquez's methodology, but some also expressed morbid fascination with what had been achieved. Lawmakers in multiple countries proposed laws specifically prohibiting the types of experimentation that had created Emma. Emma involuntarily became the face of the debate about biotechnology limits. She gave one carefully controlled interview where she spoke about the experience of discovering that the entire life she remembered was partially constructed, that she wasn't who she thought she was. She spoke about feeling like a fraud when working as a nurse using skills she remembered learning but had technically never formally studied. She spoke about looking in the mirror and seeing a dead person's face, about wondering if she had her own soul or if she was just a copy, a shadow of a person who had actually lived. But Emma also spoke about choosing to move forward, about deciding that regardless of how she had been created, she was alive now and had the right to define her own existence. She returned to work as a nurse after passing appropriate certifications under her true chronological age through a special process established by the court. She began building a life that was distinctly hers, making choices different from those Sarah had made. finding her own interests and passions rather than just following patterns inherited from Sarah's memories. Michael eventually returned to police work, but never fully recovered from the surreal experience of stopping his dead wife in a routine traffic stop. He became an advocate for criminal justice reform, focused on how unresolved trauma affected officers, using his own experience as an example of why officer mental health was critical for effective policing. He also worked with bioethicists and lawmakers to develop frameworks for dealing with legal questions raised by emerging cloning and genetic modification technologies. Robert Chambers spent the rest of his life trying to understand how both Sarah and Patricia had been victims of circumstances beyond their control. Sarah had lived and died without ever knowing a cloned version of her had been created. Patricia had become so consumed by obsession, she had turned her own daughter into an experiment. And Emma had been created without consent, developed through unethical experimental processes, living a life that wasn't entirely her own. Robert established a trust fund from his modest life savings to support Emma, his gesture of taking responsibility for not having protected his daughters from the tragedies that had consumed them both. Dr. Velasquez faced multiple criminal charges, including unauthorized human experimentation, practicing medicine without a license, and contributing to the abuse of a minor. He was extradited, tried, and sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. During trial, he showed little remorse, arguing his work had been scientifically significant, even if ethically questionable. The judge, in sentencing him, noted that creating human life as an experiment without consideration for that person's well-being or autonomy represented one of the most fundamental violations of human dignity the court had ever seen. The experimental treatments Emma had received continued affecting her in ways doctors struggled to understand or predict. Her life expectancy was uncertain. Her aging process, having been artificially accelerated, might continue at accelerated rate or might have stabilized. She could develop health problems related to genetic modifications she had received. Doctors monitored her carefully, but there were so few precedents that every examination was essentially educated guesswork. Emma developed a particularly close relationship with the community of adopted people and sperm donor children who had discovered complicated truths about their biological origins. Though her circumstances were unique, the emotional struggle of reconciling the identity you thought you had with the reality of your origins was something others had experienced in different ways. Emma found comfort in sharing her journey with people who understood what it was to question the foundations of who you were. The small traffic stop at 10:47 p.m. on October 15, 2024, had initiated a chain of discoveries that permanently changed multiple lives. Michael had found the answer to a mystery he didn't know existed, but the answer brought more questions than closure. Emma had discovered a terrible truth about her origins, but also found determination to live an authentic life despite that truth. And the world had been forced to confront the reality that scientific advances had outpaced ethical and legal frameworks in ways that created possibilities that were simultaneously wondrous and terrifying. The body camera recording of the original traffic stop remained archived in the department's records, bizarre evidence of the moment when a grieving police officer had looked into a vehicle and seen his dead wife's face looking back. Every time Michael reviewed that footage, he was reminded of how fragile our sense of reality truly was, how easily certainties could crumble when confronted with the impossible. The moment when he pointed his flashlight through that car window and saw Sarah, not Sarah, but Emma, someone who was genetically Sarah, but experientially someone completely different, remained frozen in digital pixels as a monument to mysteries that science could create, but that human wisdom was still learning to navigate.